The outlaws who had surrounded her homestead didn't notice how her hands hung loose and ready at her sides, nor did they recognize the name Sarah Swiftshot Reynolds. Their fatal mistake would soon paint the desert sand as red as the setting. Sun-dust devils danced across Rattlesnake Valley as storm clouds gathered over the Diablos Mountains, bringing the promise of rare desert rain. The widow's ranch sat nestled against red rock cliffs, a modest spread that most travelers would pass. Without a second glance, Sarah Reynolds moved with quiet grace as she fed her chickens, her dark hair streaked with silver, her simple dress and apron betraying nothing of the twin Colts concealed beneath. If you're enjoying this tale of justice in the Old West, tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story will be even more extraordinary. The Hawk's Nest gang had been watching the ranch for 3 days, believing they'd found easy prey, just another lonely widow, trying to keep her small ranch alive in harsh territory. They didn't know that before she'd married the late Thomas Reynolds, Sarah had been the most feared marshal in the New Mexico territory. Even now, 10 years after hanging up her badge, her hands hadn't forgotten the weight of her guns or the speed that had earned her the nickname Swift Shot. The ranch itself was smaller than most, but meticulously maintained. A whitewashed farmhouse faced the rising sun, its wraparound porch offering clear sightlines in all directions, a detail lost on casual observers, but second nature to someone who'd spent years tracking outlaws. The barn and corral sat to the north, while a small vegetable garden thrived against all odds in the harsh desert soil. A windmill creaked slowly in the hot breeze, drawing precious water from the depths to fill the stone-lined reservoir that had made this patch of desert. Bloomed Sarah's eyes. The color of aged whiskey continuously scanned her surroundings as she went about her daily chores. Old habits died hard, and the ones that kept you alive died hardest of all. She noted the dust cloud rising from behind Devil's Backbone Ridge. Too steady for wild horses, too deliberate for honest travelers. The Hawk's Nest gang was moving into position. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories of frontier justice, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's tale will be even more extraordinary. The gang's reputation had spread like wildfire across the territory. Led by the notorious Marcus Blackjack Hawkins, they'd left a trail of burned homesteads and empty safes from El Paso to Santa Fe. But it was their latest tactics that had earned them special attention, targeting remote widows' ranches, using the ladies' presumed helplessness against them. 3 such ranches had already fallen in the past month. Sarah's weathered hands moved to the water pump, the familiar motion masking how she counted riders through peripheral vision. 8 men, heavily armed, spreading out to surround her property. Their horses wore no brands, another detail that would have seemed meaningless to most, but spoke volumes to a former marshal. Blackjack himself sat high in his saddle, his signature dark duster making him easy to identify, even at distance. Young Jimmy Torres, who helped with the ranch's heavier work, had noticed them too. The boy's shoulders tensed as he continued stacking hay in the barn, trying to appear casual while stealing glances at the approaching riders. Sarah caught his eye and gave an imperceptible shake of her head, a signal they'd discussed for exactly this situation. The boy nodded slightly and kept working, understanding that his role was to stay out of sight and ride for help if things went badly. The storm clouds grew darker over the Diablos Mountains, and a hot wind carried the scent of rain and sage across the valley. Sarah's mind drifted briefly to the cedar box hidden beneath her bedroom floorboards, containing her old marshal's badge and gun belt. The leather would be stiff from disuse, but the Colts would be pristine. She'd maintained them with the same dedication she'd shown to her garden and her ranch. Some things, once part of your soul, never truly left you. A raven called from atop the windmill, its harsh cry seeming to mock the approaching gang's attempt at stealth. Sarah allowed herself a small smile, remembering something her late husband used to say, "The good Lord gave us signs and signals if we're wise enough to read them." Thomas had been a gentleman, a preacher who'd shown her there was more to life than manhunts and gunfights. He'd given her 10 beautiful years of peace before consumption took him, leaving her with a ranch to run and a promise to keep, that she'd never return to her old ways unless absolutely necessary. But as Blackjack Hawkins and his gang drew closer, Sarah knew that sometimes necessity wore the face of evil, and peace had to be defended with the very skills she'd hoped to leave behind. The time for choices had passed. Now there was only the familiar calm settling over her, the heightened awareness that had once made her the most feared peace officer in the territory. The gang was about to learn a harsh lesson about judging books by their covers, and why some legends never truly retired. They just waited quietly, like rattlesnakes in the shade, until trouble came looking for them. Sarah moved toward the farmhouse with measured steps, noting how the gang members unconsciously shifted in their saddles as she approached. Their body language told stories as clear as tracks in fresh snow. The way young Billy Hawks kept adjusting his gun belt, how the Reeves twins positioned themselves to flank the property. These weren't just common bandits. They had military training, probably Confederate cavalry from their formation. Blackjack Hawkins guided his stallion forward, the horse's hooves kicking up red dust that swirled in the hot wind. His dark duster bore the marks of hard travel, and the rifle scabbard at his saddle gleamed with well-maintained menace. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a snake oil salesman. "Hope we're not disturbing your day." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, portraying every bit the simple widow. "Not at all, gentlemen, though I don't often get so many visitors at once." Her eyes caught the subtle hand signals Blackjack was giving his men, standard cavalry commands for establishing a perimeter. "Would anyone care for water? The day's mighty warm. Before we continue, share where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of hidden strength, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story will be even more remarkable. The gang's reputation wasn't just built on violence, it was their cunning that made them truly dangerous. They'd perfect their approach, polite introductions, reasonable requests, then escalating demands until their victims had no choice but to comply. Sarah had seen it before, back when she wore the badge. She'd studied reports from their previous raids while others dismissed them as simple robbery. "Mighty kind of you, ma'am." Blackjack smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Truth is, we're here on business, representing the Territory Protection Association." He reached into his coat, producing an official-looking document that Sarah recognized as stolen territorial letterhead. "Times being what they are, we're offering our services to vulnerable homesteads, for a modest fee, of course." Sarah noticed Jimmy slipping deeper into the barn's shadows, following their practiced plan. The boy had good instincts. He'd make a fine lawman someday if he chose that path. "Protection?" she asked, maintaining her role. "From what, exactly?" "Why, from all manner of dangers, Mrs. Reynolds." Blackjack's use of her name was deliberate, meant to unsettle her. Raiders, rustlers, hostile natives, worlds full of threats to a lady living alone. His men had completed their encirclement, though they maintained a pretense of casual postures. "The association's fee is quite reasonable. Just 30% of your monthly earnings." The wind shifted, carrying the promise of rain and the subtle metallic click of weapons being quietly readied. Sarah recognized Monroe Reeves adjusting his rifle's sight. The man had a reputation as a sharpshooter, though she'd outshot better during her Marshal days. 30% seems steep for simple protection, she replied, her hands clasped demurely. Before her, inches from the concealed Colts. "Consider it an investment in peace of mind." Blackjack's charm hardened slightly. "Though I should mention, folks who decline our services often face Unfortunate accidents. Terrible thing how many widows' ranches have burned lately. His hand rested casually on his holstered revolver, a gesture that would have intimidated most, but told Sarah volumes about his draw speed and favored shooting hand. The tension stretched like a taut wire in the desert heat. Sarah could read them, stories written in the men's postures. Billy Hawks was the weak link, too eager to prove himself, while the Reeves twins were the real threats. Blackjack himself was dangerous, but more for his mind than his gun. These observations came as naturally as breathing, skills honed by years of facing down the territory's worst. "Mind if I fetch that water while I consider your offer?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying just the right tremor of uncertainty. Hospitality's important, even in business dealings. The question was a test, and Blackjack's answer would tell her everything about how this would play out. Of course, ma'am." His smile widened, believing he'd found his prey. "We're civilized men, after all." But his subtle gesture to his men to close ranks told a different story. They'd let her reach the porch, then make their true demands clear. Standard tactics for a gang that had terrorized a dozen homesteads. What they couldn't know was that Sarah had already mapped every angle, every line of fire. She'd counted ammunition pouches, noted who carried spare guns, identified the horses, most likely to spook at gunfire. These calculations came as naturally as drawing breath, skills that had kept her alive through 100 confrontations before she traded her badge for a wedding ring. The storm clouds grew darker over the Diablos Mountains, and a distant rumble of thunder seemed to herald the approaching violence. Sarah mounted her porch steps with the measured pace of prey, while behind her 8 killers prepared to spring a trap on what they thought was a helpless widow. They were about to learn why, even years after she'd disappeared from wanted posters. Some still whispered the name Swift Shot, with a mixture of awe and fear. In Rattlesnake Valley, word traveled as fast as tumbleweeds in a windstorm. The town of Lost Peaks lay just 2 hours' ride from Sarah's ranch, a dusty collection of buildings where the desert met civilization. The local saloon, the Broken Spur, buzzed with whispered conversations about Blackjack's latest movements. Sheriff Marcus Wade sat at his usual corner table, nursing a coffee while watching his town through tired eyes. "Another widow's ranch hit over in Mesa County," Deputy Sam Chen reported, sliding into the chair across from Wade. The young deputy's face was grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Same pattern. Professional, clean, no survivors to testify." He paused, glancing around before continuing. "They're moving this way, Sheriff, and Sarah Reynolds' place would be a mighty tempting target." Wade's weathered face showed no reaction, but his fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Few knew the truth about Sarah's past. He was one of them. 20 years ago, they'd ridden together as marshals before she'd traded her badge for a preacher's ring. "Sarah can handle herself," he said quietly. "Some fires are best left to burn themselves out." The saloon's usual afternoon crowd painted a picture of Lost Peak's precarious position. Miners from the Diablo Mountains shared space with cattle, drivers and merchants, while railroad surveyors argued over maps in the corner. The town was growing, straddling the line between lawless frontier and civilized territory. The railroad's imminent arrival had brought opportunity, and vultures like the Hawks' Nest gang. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy tales of frontier justice, make sure to subscribe. Madam Rose, the saloon's owner, approached their table. Her elegant dress and refined manner seemed out of place in the rough establishment, but appearances were deceiving in Lost Peaks. "Got something you should hear, Marcus," she said softly, setting down a fresh coffee. "Juan's boy came in from the South Trail. Says he saw riders heading toward Reynolds' place. 8 of them, led by a man in a black duster." Wade exchanged looks with Chen. 8 riders matched the gang's known numbers. "How long ago?" "About an hour." "And Marcus?" Rose hesitated. They were carrying torch materials, same kind used in the Mesa County fires. The implications hung heavy in the air. The gang's pattern was becoming clear. They weren't just robbing. These ranches, they were erasing witnesses. Wade thought about Sarah, about the skill he knew she still possessed. But he also remembered her promise to Thomas, to leave that life behind. In the saloon's corner, Edward Doc Morrison looked up from his newspaper, his clever eyes missing nothing. The town's physician had treated enough of the gang's victims to recognize their handiwork. He'd also been the one to tend Thomas Reynolds in his final days, and he knew Sarah's secret. "Interesting weather we're having," he commented, nodding toward the gathering storm. "Reminds me of that time in '68. Remember, Marcus, when Sarah tracked those deserters through a thunderstorm?" Wade nodded slightly. That had been one of her most famous cases. 3 days of tracking through impossible weather, ending with 4 captured deserters and Sarah's reputation cemented as the territory's finest marshal. "Different times, Doc." She made a promise. "Some promises," Doc replied quietly, "have to bend before they break. Better to bend than let evil men burn the world." The conversation was interrupted by the saloon doors swinging open. Young Jimmy Torres stood there, his face flushed from hard riding. "Sheriff, they're at the Reynolds place, the Hawk's Nest gang." The boy's voice carried across the suddenly silent room. "Mrs. Reynolds told me to ride for help, but—" He swallowed hard. "She said to tell you Swift Shot sends her regards." The code phrase hit Wade like a physical blow. It was their old signal, used only when blood was about to flow. Sarah wasn't just asking for help, she was announcing her return to the old ways. The choice had been made. The storm clouds over the Diablos Mountains had turned the afternoon sky almost purple, and distant lightning illuminated the desperate scene unfolding at the Reynolds Ranch. In Lost Peaks, Sheriff Wade stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Sam," he addressed his deputy, "get the horses ready. Doc might need your services before this day's done." Madam Rose touched Wade's arm as he passed. "Marcus, what should we expect?" The sheriff's face was grim as he checked his gun belt. "Either 8 dead outlaws or—" He paused, remembering Sarah's speed with a gun, her uncanny accuracy that had become legend, or a reminder of why some legends are best left undisturbed. The saloon erupted into activity as Lost Peaks prepared for what was coming. In the territory's harsh justice system, some things were understood without being spoken. Blackjack's gang had chosen their target poorly, and the storm about to break over Rattlesnake Valley wasn't just the one in the sky. Sarah reached for the water pump, her movements deliberately slow and unthreatening. The metallic taste of approaching rain hung in the air as Blackjack Hawkins and his men watched her every move. Their confidence was their weakness. 8 armed men against 1 widow seemed like favorable odds. "That's far enough, Mrs. Reynolds." Blackjack's voice had lost its false charm. "Let's stop pretending. We know this ranch sits on an underground spring, the only reliable water source between here and Lost Peaks. The railroad's coming, and this land's about to become very valuable." He nodded to the Reeves twins, who dismounted smoothly, rifles at ready. "We can do this the easy way, with you signing over the deed, or—" Sarah turned slowly, noting how Billy Hawk's trigger finger twitched nervously. "Or you'll burn my ranch, like you did to the others." Her voice had changed, the timid widow's tremor replaced by steel. "Jane Cooper was a friend of mine. She had 3 young children in that house when you torched it." Blackjack's eyes narrowed at her tone. Something wasn't right. Pray shouldn't sound so calm. "That was unfortunate business, Ma'am. Mrs. Cooper made the wrong choice. I'm offering you a better one." "Interesting thing about choices," Sarah replied, her hands still loose at her sides. 10 years ago I chose to hang up my guns, made a promise to my dying husband. But he also made me promise something else, to never let evil men prosper when I could stop them." A sudden gust of wind sent dust swirling across the yard, and thunder rolled closer. Monroe Reeves shifted his rifle, something about the widow's stance triggering old instincts. "Boss," he started to say, "something ain't—" "You know what your mistake was, Mr. Hawkins." Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying clearly despite the rising wind. "You didn't ask around about me? Didn't wonder why a widow's ranch was so well maintained, or why the local troublemakers give it such a wide berth?" Her eyes, no longer timid, held the hard glint of aged brass. "You didn't ask who I was before I was Mrs. Reynolds." Blackjack's hand moved toward his gun, but Sarah's next words froze him mid-motion. "They used to call me Swift-Shot Sarah. 10 years as a marshal, 43 bounties collected, never lost a gunfight." Her lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "And you just threatened to burn my home." The revelation hit the gang like a physical blow. Billy Hawks's face went pale. He'd grown up hearing stories about the legendary female Marshal who could shoot the flame off a match at 20 paces. The Reeves twins exchanged worried glances, their rifles suddenly feeling inadequate. "You're lying," Blackjack snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Swift-Shot disappeared years ago." "Did I?" Sarah's hand still hadn't moved toward her concealed weapons. "Maybe you'd like to test that theory. 8 against 1. Better odds than I had against the Carson boys in 66. Or was it the Beaumont gang in 67? Memory gets fuzzy after so many. Gunfights. Before we continue, share where you're watching from, and if you enjoy tales of hidden legends, make sure to subscribe. The tension crackled like the approaching lightning. Blackjack's mind raced, re-evaluating his position. If she was really Swift-Shot. But no, even legends got old, got slow. "Maybe you were something once," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "But that was a long time ago. Now you're just a widow on a valuable piece of land." "Time doesn't change some things, Mr. Hawkins." Sarah's voice carried the certainty of stone. "Like how a Remington double action pulls slightly left, or how a man's tell shows in his shooting hand before he draws." Her eyes flickered to his right hand, which had developed a slight tremor. "You're wondering if you can clear leather before I put a bullet through your gun hand. The answer is no, you can't." The wind had picked up, carrying the first few drops of rain. Blackjack felt the situation slipping away from him. His carefully planned intimidation was unraveling in the face of this calm certainty. 8 guns. Beat 2, no matter how fast you are. That's assuming all 8 of you are still standing when the shooting starts. Sarah hadn't moved, but somehow she seemed to dominate the space, her presence expanding like the storm clouds above. "Your boys are scared now, thinking about the stories they've heard. Billy there looks about ready to faint. The Reeves boys are trying to figure out if they can get a clean shot before their rifles sprout holes. And you—" She met Blackjack's eyes. "You're realizing you've made a terrible mistake." The gang leader felt sweat trickle down his spine, despite the cool wind. Everything about this was wrong. The widow's stance, her voice, the way she stood unafraid before 8 armed men, it all spoke of someone intimately familiar with violence. "Last chance," he growled, trying to regain control. "Sign over the deed or—" "No, Mr. Hawkins," Sarah cut him off. "This is your last chance. Ride away now, leave my land, and never return. Or find out if the legends about Swift-Shot were exaggerated." Thunder punctuated her words, and rain began to fall in earnest. "Choose carefully. Unlike poor Jane Cooper, I won't be the one burning today." The yard had become deathly quiet, except for the pattering of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. 8 killers faced a lone woman, yet somehow they felt like the ones under siege. Blackjack's mind raced through options, trying to find a way to salvage his plan. But Sarah's next words scattered his thoughts like leaves in a storm. "You should know. I had young Jimmy ride for Lost Peaks when I first spotted you. Sheriff, Wade will be here soon. Marcus always did enjoy seeing me work." Her smile widened slightly. So really, Mr. Hawkins, you're not just choosing whether to draw against me. You're choosing whether you want to face me now or face a posse after I'm done with you. The rain fell steadily now, drumming against the tin roof of Sarah's porch. As she maintained her position, years of experience had taught her that these moments when tension stretched time like molasses were when mistakes happened. But Sarah didn't make mistakes, not with guns, not anymore. "You mentioned the Carson boys earlier," Blackjack said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge of desperate calculation. "Heard they got the drop on Swiftshot once, down near the Mexican border. Nearly ended the legend right there." Sarah's eyes flickered briefly to a faded scar on her left arm, visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. "That they did. Want to know what happened to them after?" Her voice remained steady, each word measured like powder in a cartridge. "Might help you make your decision. Before we delve deeper into this tale of justice, share where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed for more legendary stories." The Carson incident had been her closest call, a moment that had shaped her tactics forever after. 3 brothers who'd thought they could outsmart her by using hostages. They'd learned painfully that backing Swiftshot into a corner only made her more dangerous. Now, a decade later, she was applying those hard-earned lessons. Sarah had already mapped every possible scenario. If Blackjack drew first, he'd aim center mass. Men like him always did. The Reeves twins would try to flank her, using their rifles' superior range. Billy Hawks would likely miss his first shot from nerves. Each potential move had a counter, each threat a solution, worked out with the same precision she'd once used to plan Marshal operations. "Got men in town too?" Blackjack tried, his confidence cracking further. "Any posse rides out, they'll know." "Mason and Peters?" Sarah nodded, watching him start at her knowledge of his men's names. "Currently enjoying Madame Rose's hospitality. At the Broken Spur. She serves them special drinks when troublemakers come to town. They'll wake up in time for their hanging." The revelation staggered Blackjack. His carefully laid plans were unraveling thread by thread. "How long?" he demanded. "How long you been planning for us?" Sarah's laugh was soft but held no humor. "Planning? Mr. Hawkins? I've been ready for men like you since the day I bought this ranch. Every approach mapped, every angle considered. That water trough you're standing near, deliberately placed to provide cover for the house. The barn's window slits, perfect firing positions. Even the windmill's been positioned to blind shooters from the east in the late afternoon sun." The gang members shifted uneasily, suddenly seeing the ranch with new eyes. What they'd taken for a simple homestead was revealed as a carefully designed defensive position. Even now, with rain soaking their clothes, they were standing exactly where she'd wanted them, spread out, exposed, their horses growing increasingly nervous in the storm. "Those storm clouds work in my favor too," Sarah continued, her tactical assessment flowing like the rain down her porch roof. "Lightning plays tricks on rifle sights. Rain makes fingers slip on triggers. Wet leather gun belts slow down draws. Did you notice how your men have been squinting against the wind? I positioned myself with it at my back." Thunder crashed closer now, making Billy Hawk's horse dance nervously. The young outlaw struggled to control his mount while keeping his gun trained on Sarah. Another mistake. She'd chosen his position, knowing his horse would be first to spook when the storm hit. "The Carson boys thought they had me planned too," Sarah said, her voice carrying memories of old Gunsmoke. 3 against 1. They figured those were winning odds. Want to know their mistake?" She paused, letting the tension build. "They counted guns instead of experience, just like you're doing now." In the distance, hoofbeats approached. Sheriff. Wade's posse was getting closer. Blackjack's options were disappearing like water in desert sand. His men were soaked, their nerves fraying. While Sarah remained dry under her porch roof, every aspect of the confrontation under her control. "See, Mr. Hawkins, there's something most folks never understood about Swiftshot," Sarah continued, almost conversationally. It wasn't the speed that made me dangerous. It was the planning. Every gunfight is won before the first shot, if you know how to read the signs. She nodded toward Monroe Reeves, whose rifle barrel had started to dip. Your best shot is getting tired holding that rifle up. Billy's horse is about one thunderclap away from bolting. The twins haven't noticed they're standing in a puddle that'll slow their footwork. Her assessment was clinical, precise. And you, Mr. Hawkins, your gun hands getting mighty twitchy. Pride and fear fighting each other, aren't they? The gang leader realized, with growing dread, that she'd orchestrated every aspect of this confrontation. From the moment they'd arrived, she'd been maneuvering them like pieces on a chessboard. Even their current positions, spread out to surround her, worked to her advantage, putting them at risk of crossing each other's lines of fire. Last chance, Sarah said softly, but her voice carried over the rain. Though honestly, I'm hoping you choose poorly. Jane Cooper's children deserve to see justice done. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, mixing with the thunder. Blackjack Hawkins, the most feared gang leader in the territory, found himself facing a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Either way, his reign of terror in Rattlesnake Valley was about to end. The only question was how many of his men would end with it. Sarah Reynolds, once known as Swiftshot, stood calm as mountain stone on her porch, hands still loose at her sides, waiting to see if violence would paint her ranch with blood or if wisdom would finally overcome pride. The storm above them seemed to hold its breath, lightning flickering like nature's own gun flash, waiting to see which way the powder would burn. The storm's intensity matched the psychological battle unfolding at the Reynolds ranch. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes. 8 rain-soaked outlaws facing a lone widow whose calm demeanor spoke of countless gunfights. Blackjack Hawkins felt sweat mixing with rain on his face as Sarah's words burrowed into his men's confidence. Like bullets into soft pine. You know what makes a legend, Mr. Hawkins? Sarah's voice carried over the thunder. Not the number of notches on a gun. It's the stories people tell around campfires, the whispered warnings passed between outlaws. Her eyes moved deliberately, between gang members, noting their increasing unease. Ask Billy there. He's heard the stories, haven't you, boy? Billy Hawks swallowed hard, his young face pale beneath his dripping hat brim. He'd grown up hearing tales of Swiftshot, how she could put 6 bullets through the same hole at 20 paces, how she'd once taken down the entire Matthews gang without reloading. They say you shot the guns out of 3 men's hands with 1 bullet, he stammered. Say it ricocheted perfect like. Superstitious nonsense, Blackjack snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Trail tales to scare greenhorns. The ricochet stories exaggerated, Sarah admitted, her tone almost conversational. Was only 2 men and I used 2 bullets. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Though I've had more practice since then. The rain intensified, and Monroe Reeves fought to keep his rifle steady as water trickled down his arms. Sarah had positioned herself perfectly. The porch roof kept her dry while they suffered in the downpour. Even their tactical advantage of surrounding her was turning against them as the storm forced them to divide their attention between her and the worsening weather. Your men are thinking hard now, Mr. Hawkins, Sarah continued, her tactical assessment flowing as steadily as the rain, wondering if the stories are true, calculating their chances. The smart ones are remembering other legends who disappeared after crossing paths with Swiftshot. Lightning cracked overhead, and Billy's horse reared, forcing him to lower his gun to regain control. Sarah hadn't moved, but somehow she seemed to dominate the space more with each passing moment. The Reeves boys are wondering why their brother Tom never came home from that job in Mesa County. He wasn't just running security for the bank, was he? He was scouting targets for you. The twins exchanged shocked glances. They'd never told anyone about Tom's real job. Sarah's knowledge of their operation ran deeper than they'd imagined, and that realization cut through their remaining confidence like a knife through wet paper. Got a message for you boys, she addressed the twins directly. "Tom's alive, turned himself in at Fort Griffin after our little chat, said something about retiring to become a horsebreaker in Texas." Her smile held no warmth. "Smart man, your brother knew when to walk away. Before we continue this tale of psychological warfare, tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed for more legends of the Old West." The revelation hit the Reeves twins hard. Their brother's disappearance had been a mystery, but now they were facing the woman who'd convinced him to abandon their life of crime. What had she said to him? What had she shown him that made a hardened outlaw choose an honest life over loyalty to his brothers? "You're all thinking it's 8 against 1, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "But that's not quite right. You're also fighting your own fears, the stories you've heard, the growing certainty that you're on the wrong end of a legend." Another lightning flash illuminated her steady hands. "Ask yourselves, how many of you will hesitate? How many will flinch at the crucial moment, wondering if you're about to join the stories told around campfires?" Blackjack felt his carefully constructed plan crumbling. His men were no longer the confident killers who'd arrived at the ranch. Sarah had transformed them into uncertain, frightened boys with guns, jumping at thunder and seeing death in a widow's calm eyes. "Your reputation's built on terror, Mr. Hawkins," Sarah's assessment continued. "Burning widows' homes, killing families, creating fear. But terror's a double-edged sword. Right now, your men are learning what real fear feels like." Her eyes met his, and he saw decades of gunfights in their depths. They're realizing that legends don't grow from nothing, and some reputations are earned one bullet at a time. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, mixing with the thunder. Blackjack's options were disappearing like tracks in the rain. Each passing moment eroded his men's courage further, while Sarah stood unchanged, a monument to controlled violence, waiting to be unleashed. "Monroe's wondering if he can steady his rifle enough to beat my draw," she observed. "The twins are calculating if they can reach their horses before my first shot. Billy's about ready to run. And the rest—" She shook her head slowly. "The rest are remembering every story they ever heard about Swiftshot and wondering if they're about to become part of the legend." The psychological trap was complete. Sarah had turned their own fears against them, using reputation and calculated words to accomplish what bullets might soon finish. The gang's usual tactics of intimidation had been reversed, leaving them the ones questioning their choices, doubting their skills, fearing what the next lightning flash might reveal. In the distance, a figure appeared through the rain, young Jimmy returning with the posse. Time was running out, and Blackjack Hawkins faced a choice that seemed increasingly inevitable. His reign of terror was ending one way or another. The only question was whether pride would force him to punctuate that ending with blood. In Lost Peaks, Sheriff Marcus Wade led his posse through the storm, memories of old gunfights playing through his mind. Behind him rode Deputy Chen, Doc Morrison, and a select group of townsmen, all chosen for their shooting skills and steady nerves. They'd need both when dealing with the infamous Hawk's Nest gang. "Sarah won't wait for us," Wade called over the thunder. "Not if they force her hand." 8 against 1, Chen shouted back. "Even for Swiftshot, those odds—" "Son," Wade replied, rain streaming down his weathered face. "I once saw Sarah take down 5 men while reloading. Numbers don't tell the whole story." In town, Madame Rose orchestrated her own part of the resistance. Her saloon girls moved through the broken spur with deliberate grace, ensuring Blackjack's lookouts remained unconscious from doctored whiskey. The madam herself stood at her window watching the storm through eyes that had seen their share of violence. Miss Rose, young Emily, one of her newer girls, approached. 2 more riders just came in, asking about Blackjack. "Send them to the back room," Rose smiled, her hand brushing the derringer hidden in her skirts. "I'll give them the special welcome." Throughout Lost Peaks, a carefully constructed network activated. The telegraph operator sent coded warnings to neighboring towns. The livery stable owner blocked escape routes with strategically abandoned wagons. Even the Chinese laundry, run by Chen's family, played its part, their windows offering clear lines of sight to every major street. Before we continue this tale of community resistance, tell us where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed. Back at the ranch, Sarah knew her network was in motion. Every piece had been positioned long before Blackjack's gang arrived, a strategy developed through years of experience. The storm itself seemed part of her plan, its fury isolating the gang from any reinforcements. "Your men in town won't be joining us," she informed Blackjack, watching his face tighten. "Madame Rose takes care of her own. Lost Peaks remembers what you did to the Cooper family." The rain hammered down harder as Sarah continued her psychological dismantling of the gang's confidence. Each word was calculated, each revelation timed, to maximum effect. She'd learned long ago that some battles were won with words before bullets. "The town's changed since you last rode through," she explained, her voice carrying over the storm. "We've built something here, something worth protecting. Every shopkeeper, every farmer, every saloon girl is part of it. Boys watching, messages passing, people standing together." Thunder punctuated her words as she detailed the network that had trapped them. "The livery stables blocked all escape routes south. Telegraph lines are warning every town within 50 miles. Deputy Chen's family watches the streets from their laundry windows. Even the kids running messages know their parts." Blackjack's face darkened as he realized the extent of the trap. What he'd thought was a simple raid on an isolated widow's ranch had become something far more complex. His men shifted uneasily, understanding that they weren't just facing one legendary gunfighter, they were facing an entire community's organized resistance. "Your reputation's built on targeting the helpless," Sarah continued, her tactical assessment relentless. "Widows, isolated farmers, people you thought couldn't fight back. But Lost Peaks isn't helpless, Mr. Hawkins. We've been preparing for men like you." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Blackjack's options narrowed further. His carefully planned operation had walked into a trap years in the making. Every escape route was blocked, every advantage neutralized, and at the center of it all stood a widow whose legend had never really died. "Sheriff Wade's almost here," Sarah noted calmly. "He's bringing Doc Morrison, finest surgeon in the territory. Though I suspect some of you won't need his services." Her hands remained loose at her sides, but her presence seemed to fill the rain-soaked yard. "The doc's got a saying about gunshot wounds. The ones Swift Shot delivers don't need much doctoring, just a pine box and a preacher." The gang members' faces showed the growing realization of their situation. They weren't just surrounded by nature's fury. They were caught in a web of human resistance, each strand carefully woven by a woman who turned her ranch into the cornerstone of a community's defense. Lightning flashed again, closer now, and in its brief illumination, Sarah's eyes held the hard gleam of justice long delayed. The network she'd helped build wasn't just about protection. It was about standing against the type of evil that burned homes and orphaned children. Every person in Lost Peaks had their role, their part in ensuring that the Hawk's Nest Gang's reign of terror would end one way or another. The storm reached its peak as Sheriff Wade's posse drew closer, their hoofbeats now clearly audible over the rain. Blackjack Hawkins felt time constricting around him like a hangman's noose, each second bringing him closer to a decision that would determine not just his fate, but that of his entire gang. "Your reputation's built on timing, Mr. Hawkins." Sarah's voice cut through the downpour, hitting when people least expect it, disappearing before help arrives. "But today, your timing's off." She nodded toward the darkening sky. Storms grounded the lookouts you posted in the hills. Can't signal through this weather. Can't warn you about who's coming. Lightning illuminated the scene in harsh detail. Houdin, 8 increasingly desperate men, their clothes soaked through, horses stamping nervously in the mud. Sarah remained dry under her porch roof, every advantage calculated, every pressure point identified. Minute and a half, she continued, her assessment precise as clockwork. That's how long before Wade's posse reaches firing range. Your men are thinking about those odds now. 8 against 1 seem favorable. 8 against 12? She smiled slightly. Math gets complicated when you're cold, wet, and scared. Before we continue this tale of mounting pressure, share where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed for more legends of justice. The Reeves twins exchanged glances, their rifle barrels wavering. They'd built their reputation on careful planning, but now found themselves caught in someone else's strategy. The revelation about their brother Tom had shaken them more than they wanted to admit. "Your horses are getting spooked," Sarah observed, noting how the animals shifted uneasily with each thunder crack. Rains soaked your gun belts, leathers starting to stretch. Affects the draw, doesn't it? Fraction of a second slower, but in this business... She let the implication hang in the rain-heavy air. Billy Hawk's mount suddenly reared, nearly unseating him. The young outlaw struggled to maintain control while keeping his gun pointed at Sarah, an impossible task that forced him to choose. His weapon dipped, and in that moment everyone in the yard realized what Sarah had known from the start. The gang's coordination was breaking down. "Clock's ticking, Mr. Hawkins," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of inevitable consequence. "Your men need orders. Stay and fight against worsening odds, or run and risk getting shot in the back. Pride's fighting with survival instinct, isn't it?" Blackjack felt the pressure building like steam in a sealed kettle. Every second of hesitation eroded his authority further. His usual tactics, intimidation, overwhelming force, swift violence, had been turned against him by a woman who'd transformed her apparent vulnerability into a weapon. "Monroe's thinking about his family in San Antonio," Sarah said softly. But her words carried clearly to the gang's best shot. 2 young daughters, wasn't it? Haven't seen them in 3 years. Prison's better than a pine box, Monroe. They can visit you in prison. The sharpshooter's rifle dipped slightly, his face showing the conflict between loyalty and survival. Sarah had done her research, knew each man's pressure points, each weakness that could be exploited. The psychological web she'd woven was drawing. "A tight 30 seconds, she announced as the hoofbeats grew louder. "That's how long you have before Wade's men reach optimal firing position. They've got rifles from the Army surplus, new Henry repeaters, accurate up to 300 yards. Even in this weather, thunder crashed directly overhead, making several horses dance nervously. The gang's formation, already compromised by the weather and terrain, began to dissolve as riders struggled to control their mounts. Sarah had positioned them perfectly. The storm was becoming as much an enemy as she was. "You're running out of options, Mr. Hawkins," she continued, her tactical assessment merciless. "Every second you wait, your men's nerves fray further. They're remembering every story they ever heard about Swiftshot, about Wade's reputation. With a rifle, about what happens to gang leaders in territorial prison. The pressure had become almost physical. A weight pressing down on every man in the yard. Each lightning flash illuminated faces showing increasing strain. Each thunder crash made trigger fingers twitch. The confident killers who'd arrived at the ranch had been transformed into cornered prey, and they knew it. 10 seconds, Sarah's countdown continued inexorably. Just enough time to make one last choice. Of course, some choices were made long ago, weren't they? When you decided burning widows' homes was acceptable, when you left children orphaned for profit, when you thought terror was a substitute for strength, the posse's hoofbeats sounded like destiny approaching through the storm. Blackjack's carefully constructed world of power and fear was collapsing around him. undone by a woman who turned patience and planning into weapons more potent than any gun. "Time's up," Sarah announced as the first riders appeared through the curtain of rain. Now we find out if the stories about the Hawk's Nest Gang's courage were as exaggerated as the ones about Swiftshot's aim. Her hands still hadn't moved toward her concealed weapons, but somehow that made her seem more dangerous, not less. Though I should mention, those stories about my aim, they weren't exaggerated at all. Sheriff Wade's posse emerged from the rain like avenging spirits, their rifles gleaming wet in the storm's fury. The yard had become a powder keg, with Sarah Reynolds as the match that could ignite it. Black Jack Hawkins found himself caught between his crumbling pride and the crushing reality of his situation. "Last chance, Hawkins," Sarah's voice carried over the thunder. "Though I'll admit part of me hopes you choose poorly. Jane Cooper's children deserve to see justice done." Her hands remained loose at her sides, but everyone in the yard could feel the coiled tension in her stance. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark relief. 8 increasingly desperate outlaws, 12 determined lawmen, and one widow whose legend had never truly died. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, waiting for the slightest pressure to release. "You can't take all of us," Blackjack snarled, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Someone's bound to get a lucky shot." "Luck!" Sarah's laugh was soft but carried clearly. "Mr. Hawkins, I stopped counting on luck the day I pinned on a Marshal's badge. Every move, every position, every angle has been calculated. Your men are standing exactly where I want them, their nerves frayed exactly how I planned. Before we continue this tale of justice about to be served, share where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed." Wade's voice cut through the rain. "It's over, Blackjack. Your men in town are in custody. Every escape route's blocked. Territorial marshal's been telegraphed. Only question now is how many of your boys die before you surrender." Billy Hawk's nerve broke first. His gun clattered to the mud as he raised his hands. "I'm out, boss," he called, voice cracking. "Ain't dying for this." The young outlaw had finally realized what Sarah had known from the start. Legends become legends for a reason. "Smart boy," Sarah nodded. "Step away from your horse, hands where I can see them. Wade's deputy will take your gun." Her eyes never left Blackjack as she continued, "The rest of you are thinking the same thing, wondering if your loyalty's worth dying for, wondering if you can draw faster than a legend." Monroe Reeves was next, his rifle lowering slowly. The sharpshooter's face showed the calculation behind his decision. No shot was worth certain death. The Reeves twins followed their brother's example, perhaps remembering Tom's choice to seek an honest life. 4 down, Sarah counted calmly. 4 still deciding. Though I should mention, the ones who surrender first usually get better terms. Territorial judge takes cooperation into account. Thunder crashed overhead as Blackjack watched his gang's resolve crumble. Each man who surrendered was another crack in his authority, another blow to his fearsome reputation. But Sarah wasn't finished with her psychological dismantling. "You're wondering if you can still salvage this," she addressed him directly, thinking maybe one quick draw, one lucky shot might turn the tide. "Let me help you with that calculation." Her voice took on an instructor's tone. "Your gun hands stiff from cold, draw would be slow, aim compromised by wet leather and cramped muscles. Distance is 12 yards, optimal for my Colts, especially with you silhouetted against the storm." Lightning flashed again, and in its brilliant illumination, Sarah's eyes held the cold certainty of countless gunfights. "You'd be dead before your gun cleared leather. The real question is, how many of your remaining men would follow you to hell?" 2. More gang members lowered their weapons, leaving only Blackjack and his most loyal lieutenant still holding out. The gang leader felt the last vestiges of his power slipping away like water through fingers. "What's truly interesting," Sarah continued, her tactical assessment relentless, is how quickly fear can replace loyalty. Your men have watched you threaten widows, burn homes, orphan children, but now they're seeing something different, a predator facing stronger prey. The mystique is gone, Mr. Hawkins. They're realizing you're just another bully who finally pushed too far. Wade's posse had spread out, covering every angle. Doc Morrison watched from horseback, his medical bag ready, but his expression suggesting he doubted he'd be needed. The town's resistance network had performed perfectly, and now justice was about to be served. You know what really ended the Carson boys? Sarah asked, though her question seemed rhetorical. Not the gunfight. It was the moment they realized they weren't the most dangerous thing on the frontier. That same realization is working its way through your mind right now. Blackjack's last lieutenant slowly lowered his gun, leaving the gang leader alone in his defiance. The rain had plastered his black duster to his frame, making him look smaller, less imposing. The fearsome reputation he'd built through violence and terror was dissolving in the face of a higher caliber of violence, one born from justice and skill rather than mere brutality. Time to write the ending, Mr. Hawkins, Sarah said softly. Will it be the smart ending, where you face a judge's justice, or the foolish one, where they talk about your last mistake around campfires? Her hand still hadn't moved, but somehow that made the threat more potent. Choose carefully. Legends live by their endings. The storm held its breath, waiting to see which way the powder would burn. Thunder cracked overhead as Blackjack Hawkins faced his moment of truth. For a long moment, only the sound of rain filled the yard. Then, with deliberate slowness, his hand moved toward his gun, not to draw, but to unbuckle his gun belt. Wise choice, Sarah said softly as the notorious gang leader's weapon hit the mud, though I'll admit, part of me was hoping you'd be foolish. Wade's men moved in swiftly, securing prisoners and collecting weapons. The legendary Hawk's Nest. Gang's reign of terror had ended not with blazing guns, but with quiet surrender in a rain-soaked yard. Deputy Chen began reading charges, a long list of murders, arsons, and robberies that would ensure none of them saw freedom again. Before we wrap up this tale of justice served, share where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed for tomorrow's extraordinary story. You know what your real mistake was? Sarah addressed Blackjack as Wade's deputies shackled him. Not the poor planning, not underestimating me. Your mistake was thinking terror makes you strong. She finally moved from her position on the porch, steps measured and confident. Real strength. It's in the community you tried to tear apart. The widows who rebuilt, the families who stood together, the town that refused to break. Doc Morrison approached, his medical bag unnecessary today. Bloodless resolution, he commented. Those are rare in your experience, Sarah. Maybe I'm getting wise in my old age, Doc. But her eyes told a different story. This had been her plan all along. Sometimes the most effective violence was the kind you didn't have to use. Young Jimmy Torres emerged from the barn, where he'd stayed hidden throughout the confrontation. His eyes were wide with admiration as he looked at Sarah. Mrs. Reynolds, those stories about you being swift-shot, they're all true? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Some are, Jimmy. But the most important story isn't about fast guns or fancy shooting. It's about standing up to evil, about protecting what matters. She turned to Wade. Speaking of which, Marcus, Jane Cooper's children. They should know justice was served. The sheriff nodded. I'll ride to Silver Springs myself tomorrow. Let them know the men who killed their mother will face the judge. The storm began to ease, as if nature herself was satisfied with the outcome. Sarah watched as the gang members were led away, their fearsome reputation washed away by the rain. Blackjack Hawkins, once the terror of the territory, looked small and defeated in chains. You'll be remembered, swift shot, he called back, A final attempt at defiance. Every outlaw in the territory will know this story. Good, Sarah replied calmly. Let them know. Let them understand that some legends don't fade. They just wait quietly until they're needed again. Madame Rose arrived from town with news that Blackjack's remaining men had been apprehended. The network had performed perfectly. Not a single gang member had escaped the town's web of justice. As the posse prepared to depart with their prisoners, Doc Morrison lingered. You could come back, you know. The territory could use swift shots. Legend again! Sarah shook her head, looking at her ranch, the home she'd built, the peace she'd found. The territory doesn't need legends, Doc. It needs good people willing to stand together against evil. Besides, she smiled slightly, I made a promise to Thomas. To give up guns? Morrison asked. No, Sarah corrected. To use them only when necessary, and to protect those who can't protect themselves. Today, I kept that promise. The sun began to break through the clouds, turning the rain-soaked valley into a glittering tapestry. Sarah Reynolds, once known as Swiftshot, stood on her porch watching justice ride away. She'd found something better than her legend. She'd found a home worth protecting, a community worth fighting for. Young Jimmy approached hesitantly. Will they come back? Other outlaws, I mean? Sarah's hand rested briefly on her concealed Colts. Some might, Jimmy, but they'll find the same thing Blackjack did, that legends don't retire, they just wait for the right moment. And this valley, these people. She smiled at the boy. They're worth waiting for. The storm clouds drifted away, toward the horizon, carrying with them the last echoes of the Hawk's Nest Gang's reign of terror. In their wake, they left something stronger than fear, a community united, a justice served, and a legend who had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the shots you take, but from the ones you don't have to. And if you enjoyed this tale of frontier justice, make sure to subscribe for more legendary stories of the Old West, where good people stand against evil, and some legends never truly fade away.